All right, good afternoon, folks. So today we're going to start finishing up Volcano Island. So we sort of have sort of four more main things to go, two of which we'll do today, two of which we'll do on Thursday. Once we sort of have this where it's sort of a mostly complete game on Thursday, then you'll have your first assignment, which is to basically add some additional things to this particular game and change some of the stuff that we've done. So essentially, I sort of want you to work with all of these pieces, potentially adding some extra fidelity to particle systems and messing around with some of the behavior of the fireballs and maybe messing around with animation and stuff like that. Nick, yes, the assignments will be done with the team. Yep. So it'll be a team effort. So everyone doesn't necessarily have to do everything, but I do recommend at least playing around with a bunch of the components, even if some of it might end up being on your own and not part of the final project. It is part of the final product. It is worth messing around sort of with each of the elements of this. Um, this past weekend was the Ludum Dare that I had mentioned as well. I posted a couple of sort of updatey things in the Slack channel, so that's you can always go take a look at mine. I mean, it's not super impressive, but there are I think usually a couple thousand entries in Ludum Dare at any given jam time. So it's definitely worth going out there and looking at some of the games that folks made in either the compo, which is the 48-hour solo, or the jam, which is typically done with teams over about 3 days. If anyone else did join in and also create something, definitely feel free to post it in the Slack as well. The link to the page is fine. My version does have a web build, so that's so it's easy to play. You don't have to download anything. Typically, that's sort of the best way to do these sorts of jams, so you don't have to have folks downloading a bunch of sort of extra stuff to their computers. So so it was definitely a good time. I didn't get anything else done, so there's no grading or anything done on the GDDs that you guys turned in, because I basically just spent sort of extra free time just working on the game. Okay, so so let's get in. Andy, am I hosting it through a wood server? No, I'm not. It is through like GitHub pages. So the link to it goes to my GitHub, but it's like .github.io. So that's essentially you can host a web page through your GitHub with that particular github.io repository. So you just sort of have to set it up a little bit, and then you can do it. I think a lot of people do host on itch.io as well, so you can create an account on there, and I think you can host your game through that, but I haven't done that before. So let's jump into some last pieces here for Volcano Island. So the things we have left, particle effects. So we're going to do some of that today since we talked about it all last week. We're going to do animation today. It's going to be very simple animation. It's not going to be anything special, but it is going to add a little bit of life to our main character. Right now, everything is very static. Next time, so Thursday, we'll do some sound and music, and we'll mess around with some sort of start screen / game over screen, the sort of scene management stuff that is very common. So I do have some assets to help you with this. One of them was not in the original repo that you downloaded. So I'm going to go to Blackboard here. Along with the lecture slides for today, I have this fire stylized, which is what we're going to use for an explosion, for example, and potentially for a fire trail for the fireballs. So you can download this. I'll show you just sort of dragging it in. It doesn't look like anything useful right now. In fact, it probably looks like, how are you going to use this to make fire or an explosion? But that is the power of the particle systems that we talked about. So in principle here, I sort of have 4 sort of sprites that we're going to use in combination with color over lifetime and size over lifetime and some of these things to create an effect that looks sort of like a stylized fiery type effect. So I'd created this a little while back. I actually made some modifications to it somewhat recently, but this is available for you to download, and we will drag it into the project here momentarily. Slides. So there are some assets that you can use for this. The particle effects one I just showed you, music and sound. I do have a little music clip in there as well. That was made with Bosca Seal that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And then the start and game over screen, I also have some assets that you can use that we're going to turn into like buttons and stuff like that. So there are some assets in there, but if there's anything else that I end up providing you, I will put it in the same location where the slides are linked to. So particle effect wise, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. I'll make something that looks sort of competent, but we talked about sort of particle systems for pretty much all of last week, for both lectures last week. So there's a lot of settings that you can mess with. There's basically infinite tweaking that you can do on this stuff. If you want to use the visual effects graph, for example, you want to have your Volcano Island game do visual effects graph stuff. Ideally, you should turn that into a HDRP project so that I can help with that if that's something that you want to do for the assignment. But for now, I'm just going to use the standard particle system. Ideally, we want a few effects. Things like when the fireball hits the ground, when the fireball hits the player, you might want a different effect for that. Maybe you want a particle system that spawns a bunch of, I don't know, ice cube looking things when the player dies. So in addition to this, you might want a fire trail on the fireballs. You can spawn tiny little particles over the snowman to make it look like it is sweating, for example. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with particle effects. Most of those I will leave to you guys to do for the assignment for Volcano Island. But the main thing I want to show you today deals with how do we play an effect when something happens. So when the fireball hits the player, how do we ensure that we can actually play a burst of particles effects that looks like an explosion or something? So we're going to keep it simple for now. Again, later on, you might want to increase the fidelity of these graphics. And I think, yeah, there's just some of the code stuff. So we're going to jump into Unity. And the first thing that I want to do, let me grab the image here, wherever it happens to be. So I'm going to take that stylized fire, and I have a textures folder. So make sure you create a folder to put your whatever textures you're creating. Create a textures folder, and I'm going to drag this into here. So I just dragged it from where I downloaded it into the textures folder. The way that this is set up is actually perfectly fine. It is set up as this is just a single image with these sort of four little things in it. One of them kind of looks like a little duck or something. This is fine the way it's set up. I mentioned this a couple times. We will talk about all of these import settings because they can be very important depending on the game you're trying to make. But for now, we can just leave it like this and everything will be fine. The other piece to this is a material. Our particle system needs a material, not just a texture. So we need to make a material and apply this texture to it. So I also have a folder called materials in my assets folder. Again, I'm trying to keep everything sort of organized in a useful way, so that if I know that I need to edit a material or I need to find a prefab, I know where to find them rather than just shoving them all into the same folder. So I also have a materials folder. So you want to create one of those as well. You can name it materials. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to say create material. And you can name it whatever you want to. I'll probably name it, I don't know, fire or something. At this point, it doesn't really matter because we're not going to have any more materials in our project. But I'm going to name it fire. Now, the shader that we want to use for this is one of the particle shaders because this is going to be a particle. So up at the top in the inspector, it has the shader drop down, and I'm going to select particle standard unlit. The unlit version of these particles, I don't know if I mentioned this last week, the unlit version of these particle shaders means that lights in your scene aren't going to affect what the particle looks like. And typically for things like fire and sparks and, I don't know, magic spells that get casted, typically you don't want the lights in the scene to influence what these particles actually look like. So most of the time for sort of standard sort of particle system usage, you'll just use the standard unlit particle shader. So again, I created a material, said create. So I right-clicked in here, said create material. You name it whatever you want. And then I changed this shader to particles standard unlit. There might be some changes we have to make here to make this sort of look the way we want. The biggest change is in the maps. So this is where we want to put our texture. And let me spotlight on here. So the maps here, this is where we want to put our texture. So we can click on the tiny little, the little circle with the dot in it that's right before albedo. And I need to find my fire stylized. I can double click on that. Now, our example of sort of what the shader would look like didn't change. So up in the rendering mode, I'm going to change this to, we'll mess around with this a little bit later, but I'm going to change this to additive. So in the blending options, I have render mode, additive, color mode, multiply. And I'll show you what some of the other ones do and sort of how they change that here in a minute. But now we see those 4 individual textures, or the one individual texture with sort of 4 pieces to it. So this is my material. I don't need to change anything else. We'll come in here and maybe mess with the rendering mode, but we need to make sure we have the map. So again, that's the circle with the little dot in it right before albedo. We choose the texture, and then we mess with the rendering mode. Fade will also give you a similar look. Transparent, not going to be what we want. Cutout is useful, but we can take a look at it a little bit later. So additive is what's going to probably look good for this particular particle system that we're going to create. So when you have the material, then we can, in the hierarchy, create an empty. So I'm going to call this explosion. And I'm going to add the particle system component to it. So we get back to sort of where we were last week when we first started with particle systems. I have these sort of magenta particles, and they're just sort of floating out of the center here where this object is located. I'm going to take my explosion and make sure that it's set to 0, 0, 0. It was sort of off somewhere else, so I put it back to 0, 0, 0. And because my snowman is here, I'm just going to move this over a little bit. I have the handles here because I have the sort of 4 arrows up here in the upper left. I have those selected, so I get the arrows when I click on an object. So I'm going to move this around a little bit so it's sort of off center. It's not sort of in the same area as my snowman guy.
Professor?
Yep.
Sorry, I just I fell behind for a sec.
Yep.
Did you, for that particle, did you just go into the hierarchy and just create the particle effect in there?
Yeah. So I created an empty, and then gave it a name, and then I did I clicked on add component and threw in the particle system. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So again, we've messed around with a lot of these settings previously. So I'm not going to do anything sort of too crazy here, but I want to introduce one additional one. So for the renderer, this is where we actually put our material. So I'm going to open that one first. And the material for each particle goes into the material slot here. So I have my material already open, that fire material I just created. I'm going to drag that into the material here. Maybe it looks kind of interesting, but definitely not what we want. Definitely isn't invoking the sort of explosion idea. That's because I don't intend to use the entire image as one particle. I want to use a quarter of the image as one particle, and maybe choose a random one of those images for each particle that gets created. That's why I put them all together. So you can sort of think of this as a sort of a sprite atlas is sort of a name for what I've given you here. So there is a way for us to do that. There's an option in the particle system for a texture sheet animation. So it's a couple above the renderer. So if I turn that on and I start messing with this a little bit. So one of the options in here is tiles, and it has X and Y. And they're both default set to 1. This is how many tiles are in your texture. So for me, it's 2 by 2. I have 4 tiles total, 2 rows, 2 columns. So I change X and Y to 2. And now we see that the particles get spawned as one version of the particle, and then over time, they're changing. So if I had a cool sort of progression of like smoke or fire, I had a texture that I downloaded from somewhere that I created myself, then this would work really well. The texture would sort of change over time, and then I'd do whatever I want to with the color and the velocity and all that other stuff. That's not quite what I want here. I didn't set up the texture that way, but this is one of the ways to set up a texture, to have it so it sort of plays an animation over time. So that would actually work for this. What I want to do is just pick a random one of those tiles and display it for the entire lifetime of the particle. So what you do in this texture sheet animation is we don't have to change any other settings except for frame over time. Right now, it is a curve. But I don't want a curve. I just want it to give me one random frame. So over in the little drop-down on the right for frame over time, I'm going to say random between 2 constants. And I'm going to put in a 0 for the first one and leave it at, in this case, it says 3.9996. That's fine. I'm going to leave it there. And now look what happens to the particles. It spawns a random particle from one of those 4, 0, 1, 2, and 3, which is why I can't actually put 4 in here. 0, 1, 2, and 3 every time a particle spawns. So if you have a gigantic texture sheet and you want to just a random one of those particles to spawn each time, this is how you do it. So you change your number of tiles you have, and then you change the frame over time to be between 2 constants and random between 2 constants. And this time it'll go from 0 to 3 in this case. So we're actually starting to get there for our explosion. This isn't a burst of particles, it's just constantly spawning them. So let's change this to a burst. So my renderer, I'm basically done with that. The texture sheet animation, there's no other settings I need to change. So I'm going to take the emission, and I'm going to take the rate over time, and I'm going to reduce it down to 0. And because I just want the burst. So for the bursts, right now it's empty. So I'm going to add a burst in, and I might increase the number of particles, maybe like 50 particles or something. This is going to loop for the moment, which is fine because it just lets me sort of watch it happen. When I actually finish this effect, I don't want it to loop. I just want it to play once and then be done. We're getting closer, but we probably want the particles to move a little faster to start with and definitely have less of a lifetime. So some of those initial settings I can set up here in the top. So in the top part of my particle system. So I'm pretty much done with emission, so I can shrink that down. Let's say I want the lifetime, maybe the lifetime only a second. So from 5 seconds, just set it down to 1. So they're going to last a lot shorter amount of time. And maybe, I don't know, the start size, we may end up changing that. The speed, potentially we can, and that's the one that's highlighted here. Potentially we can increase the speed. That might mean we need to decrease the lifetime more. So we'll mess around with the settings. Again, there's an infinite number of things that you can possibly do with this. The one that I want to use to cause these particles to slow down, I don't want them to just sort of continue at the same speed. I just want to sort of just start fast and then slow down to almost a stop, is the limit velocity over lifetime, which we messed around with last week. And I'm just going to increase the drag. So if I put the drag at 5, watch it happen here. Okay, not quite, maybe a little too high, so maybe I'll drop it to 1. I think sort of overall, that looks a little better. Now they are spawning in a large area, so that's where we have to look at the shape. Currently it's a cone, which is probably not ideal for an explosion. So I'm going to set it to a sphere. So I can see my sphere here. And I'm going to reduce the radius. So make it a bit smaller. So now we should see they spawn in this sort of small area, and they spread out real fast. So I might increase the drag a little bit more, maybe turn the drag up to 3 or something, sort of see what that looks like. Again, and I know I mention this all the time, but there's lots and lots of things that you can change here to change the look in very subtle ways. The rotation on them is pretty much all the same. So there is the start rotation in these sort of standard settings, and we can actually set this to be random between 2 constants. So I can say like -45 to 45, so they'll get some rotation in there as well. Gabe in the emission, I just turned off rate over time, and I added a burst. So I just I clicked the plus sign for the empty list, and then I changed the count to the count is just how many particles in that burst. Again, right now it's looping. We'll turn off looping once we're satisfied with it. So that is sort of the start to this. It's okay. Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
Sorry. I just missed in the materials how you got it to stop being a white square and switch to the shapes.
So in the material setting, ideally you'll probably want either fade or additive. Otherwise, everything else should be okay here, other than you do have to add the texture albedo. So as long as the map is the graphic, then additive or fade in the rendering mode.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so go back over to the explosion. Yep. We might need a few more particles because there's some gaps in there, but it's looking a little better sort of motion-wise. But we do want color. So color over lifetime. I'm gonna activate that and open up the gradient editor. And probably what you want to do is for the alpha, the transparency, which is the top handles on our gradient, we probably want completely transparent at the beginning and completely transparent at the end. So that way it sort of fades in and fades out. But we do need some opaque values in between. Most likely the fade in is going to be shorter than the fade out. So just by changing it now with this white color, the white color I have here, you can see that sort of fade out and maybe a little bit of the fade in, although the fade in is much faster. Color-wise, that's on the bottom here. I can select one of the handles, and I can change maybe to a yellowish color to start with. And then maybe somewhere midway down, I can change this over to maybe an orange. And then finally at the end, have it be a little bit of a dark red or something. So the gradient itself, this is purely preference. The yellow might be a little bit too much at the beginning. It's up to you. But you can start to see the explosion sort of coming together here. Once we added in some drag, some velocity, maybe a relatively high start speed. Once we add in that color over lifetime and maybe change the size over lifetime, we start to get something that looks interesting. Some more particles might be worth putting in here. It depends on your preference, but that's the idea for this little sort of fiery sort of explosion, sort of fiery stylized explosion. And really, it wasn't a whole lot of these little modules. The shape and emission we use anyway. The main one here was limit velocity over lifetime, color over lifetime, and the texture sheet animation with the sort of the standard modules. So not a whole lot of effort, but something that sort of looks decent in sort of the art style of our game, hopefully. So once you have that set up to where you want it with whatever settings you want to have, and again, you can infinitely tweak this, but once you have it set somewhere decent, I'm going to open up the prefabs folder. Right now, it only contains our enemy. And I'm going to drag the explosion object from the hierarchy into the prefabs. So now I have a prefab that is the explosion. So that when one of these fireballs hits the character or the ground, we can instantiate an explosion particle effect. So we'll do that in the actual code itself. So ending my color here, yeah. Uh, so remember that. I don't know, yeah. So remember that the top above the actual gradient itself is the alpha channel. So that's the transparency. So black here, or sort of all the way to the left, 0 is going to be fully transparent, and then white is going to be fully opaque. So in here, I have fully transparent at the start and the end for the handles there, and then in between, I have fully fully opaque, so that it sort of fades in and then fades out. And I have the fade out happen over a longer time.
So the top is transparency, and then the bottom is color.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
And then how do you make a preset? How would you like take that to make a preset?
Yeah. So you should just be able to click on new. So if you click
Okay.
on new, it should add it to the presets here. And,
Awesome.
and then you can make like preset folders and stuff like that as well. So if you have a bunch of presets for like fire stuff or something, like fire type gradients, then you can make a folder and throw a bunch of fire type presets in there as well.
Absolutely. Thanks.
And then of course the bottom is color. So then you just use the color picker to pick what you want. Yours is probably at RGB. So if you want to use the sliders, it'll be the RGB sliders. If you work with this stuff for a while, you may find HSV actually a little bit more useful depending on what you're trying to do. So that's typically what I have my sliders set to. But usually I'll just use the color picker like this. And then, yeah, select whatever colors you want. There can be HDR colors. So if you mess around with any sort of HDR stuff in Unity before, there can be HDR colors, but it's easier to use them with a custom shader. So that's just sort of another piece of this. I think if I pick some of the HDR colors here, they're not going to look too good, because a custom shader would be much better for that. So we will talk about shader graph and sort of custom shader stuff in the future. Okay, so that's my color stuff there. I want to show you another one that I made earlier. I'm going to bring this one in. This is a potential for a fire trail. It's the exact same graphics. It's exactly the same. The color over lifetime is almost identical as well. Here I might have a little bit darker reddish color here, and an orange here, and a yellow, and then to black finally at the end. And the only real difference is that they're just moving up. So I think the shape is just a cone. So it's just a cone. They're moving up, and I'm using size over lifetime and rotation over lifetime as well. So they just rotate over lifetime, and they get smaller over lifetime. So that's why you see them small at the top, larger at the bottom. It's the same graphic, same sort of fire stylized type graphic, but something that I could add to the fireballs, for example. So I could have the fireballs have this little fire trail as they move. Now our fireballs move pretty slow, so this might look a little weird if attached to a fireball, but it's the exact same idea. So mess around with this particle systems, especially for your assignment. I'm going to ask you to play around with the particle systems. So mess around with them, sort of get a feel for how they work, what kind of shapes you can use, what some of the gradient color things are useful for. If you want to make some of your own simple graphics, I mean, really, literally for this graphic, all I did was in my so I use Affinity Photo, but in Photoshop or whatever, I basically made a blob of white in these 4 regions, and then I just took my eraser, because I had a transparent background. I just took my eraser, made a real big circle out of it, so it would erase a lot, and then I just sort of put a bunch of divots in it, and then sort of carved off some extra stuff. And that was it for all 4 of these. So you can kind of see that if you end up looking closely at it, like this right here is part of my part of the delete that happened of the blob of white. So I didn't do anything special. There's nothing special about this graphic. It was a very easy one to make, and it ends up giving you something that doesn't actually look too bad. So there is an art to making particles, but sometimes you can just slop together some stuff and the particle system will do most of the visual work for you. So this is something that I'll definitely want you to mess around with for the assignment. But the main one for the moment is, back to my prefabs, is the explosion, because we want to make sure we can instantiate that when something happens in our game. So we have it as a prefab. I'm going to go ahead and make one more change to the prefab, but I'm going to do it actually in the prefab itself. So I'm going to delete the one that I have in my hierarchy because I don't need that anymore. I have the prefab. I can open the prefab, and we should be able to watch it here if we play, or maybe not. Let's see. The main thing I need to do is turn off looping. Otherwise, it should play. It's interesting that it's not playing in here. We wanted to turn off looping. That was one of the things that I'd forgotten to do. So we just wanted to play once. So if I drag it in here, it should play once, and then it should be done. Okay. Now we have a little bit of code. The code itself isn't too much, but it's something that you will want to do, and I'm going to explain a little bit about why I sort of choose to do it this particular way. If we go back to the slides, this is in the enemy class. So the enemy class has our onTriggerEnter 2D function. So currently it just checks if the collision tag is the player, and then it has the player take damage, and that game object gets destroyed. So the fireball itself is destroyed. Basically, it's despawned. It's sort of deallocated. We're going to add in a ground tag as well, so that when the fireball hits our ground box, it's going to explode or look like it explodes. And then also we'll add one in for the player. Potentially these two graphics should be different, but for now we're just going to keep the one explosion graphic. So along with that, I'm going to make a public game object called death effect. Yeah, and you can drag it right into your folder, and it'll automatically make a prefab from your hierarchy. So I'm going to make I'm going to have a reference to a death effect. We're going to drag our prefab into the death effect in Unity, and then we'll instantiate it. So I'm going to write this little bit of code here. I do have to worry about the ground. So let's see. Yeah, we do need a ground, something that is tagged ground. So in Unity, I do have the ground thing here from last week. It's basically just an empty that I added a box collider to. I'm going to set the tag to ground. This tag is one that you should already have in there if you started with the start of the project that I initially put up. If not, you can always say add tag, and then you can add one using the plus sign and give it a name. So for my ground, I want to make sure this is tagged ground. So when the fireball hits this box collider, it's going to give that trigger, the onTriggerEnter 2D. It's going to check the tag. If it's tagged ground, then we're going to do stuff, which is going to be play the explosion graphic, or play the explosion particle system.
Does the game manager have a tag? Sorry, I think I removed it.
So that the game manager, I don't have a tag with the game manager. So the only tags that we're going to need to use for the game are the player having the player tag, and the ground having the ground tag. There are other ways to sort of deal with this sort of knowing which object you're interacting with from a collision, but the tag is probably one of the simpler ways. So in my script, I'm going to open up the enemy script. So this is something that we finished. I think it was last time we added the sort of the onTriggerEnter 2D stuff. So I print out collision, and then if the other dot tag, so other is that other collider that we hit. If the other dot tag is the player, then the player takes damage, and then we destroy the object. So I want another if in here. I'm going to say if other dot tag, if that's equal to ground, then I also want to do something. In this case, we want to instantiate that prefab explosion that we created. So up at the top, so I have my little if statement here. Up at the top, I'm going to create and I'll put it here. I'm going to create a public game object called death effect. So when the fireball dies, I want to play the death effect. This is public, so it's going to be in my inspector. So I'm going to need to drag something in there. But for now, I can use this as any old game object. So I can instantiate a death effect. So I use the instantiate function. And it needs 3 things. Or at least this version needs 3 things. It needs the object I want to spawn, which is the death effect. It needs the position. Where is this going to spawn? There's a couple ways we can do this. If you look in the slides, I do it in a slightly different way. I actually grab all 3 components. If you need to shift an effect for any reason, you might need to grab all 3 components. But we should be able to just use this .transform .position. So it's going to spawn it right where the fireball is. So that should make sense. If I want to spawn this death effect over the fireball, I want to spawn it exactly where the fireball is. The rotation can just be identity. So a lot of times you will just use quaternion identity. I don't need to worry about rotation. It doesn't matter in this particular case. So I'm just going to use quaternion.identity. I'll mention the difference in the ones that I use in the slides. So right now, if there is a collision, it'll check if it's the player and apply damage. If it's the ground, it'll instantiate the death effect, and in either case, or say in both cases, it's going to destroy the game object. Now you may wonder, well, why do we have to instantiate this? Why can't I just put the particle system as a component on the fireball and just play that particle system when we hit the ground or the player? The key is this. I want that fireball to go away in a very easy way. So I can destroy the fireball this way. But as soon as I destroy the object, everything related to that object goes away. So if my particle system was actually attached either as a child or as a component to the fireball itself, this would destroy the particle system. So by having them totally detached, one is a prefab, the other one is a completely different prefab, I can instantiate the particle effect and actually completely delete the fireball. And the death effect will continue to play and do all of its stuff until it finishes. So we're going to check if this works when we hit the ground. So remember, the ground is right around, let this compile. The ground is right around here, so it's not right below the snowman. I need to make one more change. Yeah, make one more change, which is in the enemy prefab, I need to make sure that I add in the death effect here. So I'm going to take my explosion prefab and I'm going to throw it in here. Let's see. Got the collider. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't see that in the enemy prefab. Where?
So in my prefab folder.
Yep.
For the enemy prefab that we created, I added in that death effect into the enemy script. So it should show up in the enemy script component, provided it was public. So up here in the enemy script, I made the public game object death effect. So that should show up here after the compilation takes place. And then you should be able to drag in the explosion.
Yeah, I just didn't save in Visual Studio. Sorry.
Gotcha. Yep. That happens quite a bit to me as well. I'm like, I swear I made that public. Okay, so I'll make sure that this should work. Okay. We may need a rigid body on the ground to have this work the way we want. We'll have it instantiate for the player as well. So I don't think, yeah. So because it's not disappearing, I think we're going to need a rigid body on the ground as well. Let's add it into the player and make sure that the player actually spawns that. Death effect as well. So back into the code real quick. Yeah. So the explosion effect also does also remain. So I'm going to show you one of the settings we can do to mess with that as well. So my instantiate here, I'm going to also copy and paste that, and I'm going to do the same death effect. Again, you probably want separate death effects. You might have like a hit the player effect and a hit the ground effect, two separate ones. I'm just going to use the same one for both, but we are going to instantiate them essentially in the same way. So let this compile here and throw this guy in, and we should see that. So that's my explosion. Now, if you look in the hierarchy, and this is a really good reason to have the hierarchy open and be able to see it when you're testing. The explosion object is still here. It still exists. Even though the explosion's done playing, it is still there. It looks like I'm getting some no reference stuff because of the player is completely gone and there's some other stuff happening. So we'll fix that later on. So the explosion is still there. So for our explosion prefab, I'm going to open it up. We do have an option to what to do when it's done. Under the stop action for the explosion. So when it finishes, when it stops, we want to destroy. So the explosion remains in the hierarchy otherwise. So this is a very easy one to forget, but if you're watching the hierarchy, you'll see that this thing I'm instantiating is always there. Now this is directly related to the duration, not the lifetime of the particles, the duration of the actual particle system itself. So the lifetime of my particles is only 1 second. So maybe I'll change the duration to 2 seconds. So the explosion object should stick around for the 2 seconds. And then the stop action, when it's done, is to destroy. So if we play again, go back to the regular hierarchy, we don't have that explosion. We don't have that explosion object sitting around the entire time. So that is something. It's an optimization thing. Typically, you don't want to have these sort of objects floating around your scene and potentially getting to thousands and thousands of them. Now let's fix the ground. Gabe, your explosion seems to take a second to actually explode. I don't have any start delay set, so there's a little start delay thing here. Potentially, I'd probably have to take a look at sort of what it looks like to see if there's any sort of other issues that might be preventing it from sort of playing right away. That's something that potentially I can look at after class, because there is a start delay, but it should just be 0 by default. So ground-wise, I'm going to add the rigid body 2D, and I'm going to make sure that the gravity on here is 0, so that it's not falling down. The emissions, there are settings in the emission, particularly for the burst one, where there's some other timing stuff related to the burst as well. So this one here, we should get the explosion now because we added the rigid body to the ground. Nick, the destroy stop action, it might check your time, check the duration that you have. Otherwise, I'd probably have to take a closer look at it. So we've got an explosion when we hit. Again, I show you that you've added some particles to the fireball. Those you could probably add directly to the fireball, either as a child or as a particle system in the prefab. Because you want to destroy the whole thing. You don't want the fire the fire trail hanging around after the actual fireball has exploded. So that's something to mess with. I do want to switch over to the animation stuff. So this is basically all I'm going to talk about particle system wise. So make sure that you can get to a point where you can spawn this particle system in. You can spawn it in when something happens. So in this case, when the collision happens.
How would you change the size of the fire or like a prefab?
So there's a couple ways to go about it. For this particular one, it shouldn't be, and I don't know why this one's not displaying here when I want it to. It's possible. Change this back to 0 here. We'll go back to this. That should be. I don't know why this one's not actually playing here for me here. So let me go to the other. Let me go to the fire trail one. So yeah. So for something like this, depending on what you want to do, sort of size related stuff. Sort of you can look at the transform of the object for the scale. This won't necessarily always change what your particle system does in terms of like if you have a burst or something, but you can dynamically change the scale like this. So this is up in the transform. Typically, I'll leave it at 1 and change the particles to do this, to change the particle size to sort of match what I want. But if you want to make a smaller version of the same particle system, maybe you have I don't know, there's engines on a spaceship, and you have some larger sort of fire trail off the engines, and then you have some smaller engines or something. Then it's perfectly reasonable to mess with the scale here. So that is an easy way to do that as well. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And I have one thing, I don't know what happened, but my player starts like spinning around now. Do you know how that could have happened?
If it's after he gets hit by a fireball, it's likely because of the rigid body. So one of the things that I did with the enemy, so if I go back to the enemy prefab here, one thing I did with the enemy was I made it so that it is a trigger. If you have a trigger on, then it won't interact with the rigid body by sort of knocking it around. So that might be the case. Otherwise, I could take a look at it after class too.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so animation is a sort of completely different beast. It is a lot of settings in the inspector. There'll be a little bit of code at the very end where we say play this animation or play that animation. But it is a lot of little settings, and some of it's preference, of course. So there's a million settings you can change, just like with particle systems. We're going to make a very simple animation where our sort of snowman sort of bounces. So we'll sort of have a bouncing snowman. It'll show you the reason why I have 2 segments. If we look at the image of the snowman, the actual original sprite, it's totally separated. And we made a separate head and a separate body. And then we sort of put them together the way we wanted it to look. This wasn't just so we could adjust where the head was located in relation to the body. This was so we could animate the head and the body separately. So the head can be doing something totally different than the body, which will hopefully make this look a little bit better. We're doing something very simple. Unity also has a bone-based animation system. It's not something that we're going to specifically talk about in this class, maybe at the end of the semester, depending on what time we have left. But bone-based animation is essentially where you apply sort of a 2D mesh to your sprites, and then as you move stuff, it sort of stretches things out. If you've ever done any 3D animation before, it's the exact same process, just 2D. Bone-based animation is very useful, but it does take a bit more work to mess with. So we're just going to do some very simple animation here first. I think I have the slides. I think I'm going to do stuff in slightly different order than what I have in the slides, but we're still going to keep organized. And I'm just going to go through how Unity uses a state machine to run animations. We're going to create 2 specific animations for our character, an idle animation and a run animation. So idle is just when the character's not moving. Running is when you're pressing one of the arrow keys. either direction. So we will start with idle first. So I'm going to go through most of this. I'm probably not going to switch back to the slides much sort of after this, because most of what I have here on the slides is just, hey, here's the things that you look at, and then just explanations, sort of slide explanations of what I'll be talking about and demonstrating. So to start with, in my assets folder, I'm going to create a new folder called animations. So we're gonna still keep organized here. I'm gonna create a folder called animations, and within here, I'm gonna be even more organized, and I'm gonna create another folder called player. So these will be my player animations. There's two things we need. We need to create, so I'm gonna right click in here, and I'm gonna say create animator controller, and I'm gonna call this player. And then we need actual animations. So I'm going to create two animations. These are about a little bit lower than midway down the create menu. I'm going to create two animations, one for idle. I'm going to create another one for run. So within my animations player folder, I've got a player animator controller and two animations, an idle and a run. We're almost done with the setup. I'm going to click on my player object. So this has the player script, the rigid body, and the collider. And I'm going to say add component. And I'm going to add an animator. This component takes a controller, which is what we just created here. So I'm going to grab my player animator controller, and I'm going to drag it in. That's all the setup I need for this. So I'm done with the player object for adding components to it, and the animation controller, we're going to mess with that in a second, and with the animations, we'll mess with them in just a second. So again, I created an animator controller, two animations. So right-click, create animator controller, and two animations. On my player, I added the animator component, and I put the controller into the location here. That player controller I made, I put it into the controller location in the animator. Now I'm going to double click on this player animator controller. It brings up a new tab. It's useful to split this off into its own little place. So I'm going to take that tab and I'm going to drag it. And then I'm just going to dock it right here. So I can still see my snowman with the scene on one side, and I have my animator here on the other. It has mostly the same controls that you're used to in Unity. So if I left click, or if I middle click and drag, it pans. If I scroll wheel, it zooms in and out. At this point, I'm going to take my idle animation that I created. I'm going to drag it in to the window. Same thing with the run. Do the same thing here. So hopefully this gives you an indication of what this animator controller does. The animator controller contains animations. And it's going to let us know when to play particular animations. So we're going to be setting some stuff up in the animator controller once we have our animations created. The first animation you dragged in is going to be the entry point. So it's connected to the entry here. So as soon as my player gets created, so in other words, as soon as it spawns, it's going to go directly to the idle animation. We're going to make some changes to code to tell it when do we go from idle to run, and when do we go from run back to idle. So we will set up those transitions. But for now, we have the two animations. Now, if I double click on one of my animations in my assets folder over here, I get a whole brand new window, and it's the animation window. So I'm also going to dock this along with my animator. So I sort of have three sort of main panels set up. I have the scene, I have my animation and animator, and then I have my hierarchy inspector sort of combo over on the right. This is typically the way that I end up working with this, mainly because I can see my character I'm about to animate, and I can see any other sort of animation stuff that potentially is going on. In order to get animating, I'm going to go to the animation tab here, and I'm going to select my player. So in the hierarchy, I select the player. I have my animation panel open. And notice if I click on this drop-down that says idle, I have both idle and run. So it already knows, because I have the animator component, Unity already knows, oh, there's two animations as part of that, idle and run. So then you might wonder, all right, how do you actually do the animation now? How do you actually make this animation work? It's all keyframe based. So keyframes mean at certain points in time, you select where you want objects to be, what their properties are, whether they're rotated, scaled, moved to a different position, whatever it may be. Unity will then interpolate between the beginning of the animation and wherever you said these things should be. It'll interpolate and play the animation. So let me give you a quick example of that. I'm going to zoom in on my timeline a little bit, and I'm going to go over by 10 frames. So this white line you see moving, this is frame 0, this is frame 10. It's frame 0 to frame 10. Mary, to open up the windows, the two little tabs that I have here, it's basically, you can just double click on the stuff in your assets folder. So for the player animator controller, I can double click and that'll open it up. And for the animation itself, I can double click on the run or the idle and it will change. Player. So I want to be on the idle animation. And I'm going to scroll over, maybe I'll scroll over 20 frames here. So I went from the 0th frame to the 20th frame. And maybe on that 20th frame, on the head, so in my hierarchy here, I clicked on the head. Maybe in the 20th frame, I want my head over here. Nothing changed in here. And in fact, if I want to preview the animation, it doesn't look like anything actually happens. A very easy thing to forget while you're doing this is you have to press the record button. So I'm going to press Control Z to move the head back to where it was. There's a record button right here, the red circle. So I'm going to click record. So now it's actively recording any changes I make. So if I move back to the 20th frame and I move over here at the head, now notice some stuff has popped up. It says head position. And I'm going to turn off the recording here. It says head position, and it shows up a little diamond at 0 and a diamond here where my line is at 20. If I scroll between this, it does the interpolation. So I've just created an animation. Okay, it's not very interesting, but this is how you record changes you make to your objects. The keyframes are going to be where the diamonds are. So you choose some section of your animation. You want 20 frames later, you want the head to be here with this rotation and this scale or whatever, then that's what you can do. I'm going to go to frame 40, and I'm going to take my first keyframe. So I'm going to click on it to select it. Now it's blue. And I'm going to copy. I'm going to press Control C. I'm going to press Control V. So now I have the first keyframe is the same as the last keyframe. That's the key to getting a looping animation. So if I play this now, see how it loops. It goes to that position and then back. And then the animation just continues to loop over and over again. Now let's say I don't want to do this with this guy. I'm going to delete the other two keyframes, and I'm back to having no animation at all. I don't have any other keyframes in here, and we're just at this position. So let me show you what you can do, for example, here. So let's say I want to do a 30 frame animation total. So I'm going to take that first keyframe and make sure that it's the same at the beginning and the end. Then maybe 10 frames in, I'm going to scale the head slightly. Maybe let's do positions. And since we're on position here, let's do position. Remember to click record. And maybe 10 frames in, I want to move the head up slightly. And then 20 frames in, I want to move the head down slightly. Turn off record and play the animation. So now his head's sort of bopping up and down. We can also change, say, the scale. So I still have the head selected, but up in the upper left, I can select the one that shows the little tiny little box scaling to a larger box. And I maybe 15 frames in, I want to change the scale so his head sort of stretches a little bit. But I didn't turn record on. Again, it's an easy one to forget. So I turn record back on, and I want his head to stretch just a little bit. It sort of jumps back to the original position. Because remember, if I want a looping animation, I need to take the first keyframe and make sure it's the same as the last keyframe. So now his head sort of stretches. When his head goes up, it sort of stretches a little bit, and then it goes back down to normal once his head sort of is at its lowest position. And we can do the same thing with the body. So in my hierarchy, I'm going to select the body. I'm going to press record. And maybe at frame 10, when the head's going up, maybe I want the body to squish down a little bit with the scale. And then in frame 20, maybe I want it to stretch up a little bit. And then I'm going to take the body scale first keyframe and set it to the last keyframe as well. So I get some now that sort of looks like this. So this is another one of those situations where you can do an infinite amount of customizing and messing around with it. This one, maybe I should reverse a few of the things. Maybe I should have the body stretch a little bit when its head goes up, rather than like a stretch sort of up a little bit rather than stretch down. This is something that you can mess around with to get this the way you want it. So I'm gonna be content with this here, and I'm gonna click play. If you looked closely, if depending on how choppy stuff was, I don't know how choppy everything is here on Zoom all the time, but if I have this animation set up, it runs one time, and then it stops. I set it up to loop, but that's also a setting. So if I just click once on my idle animation, the loop time is not checked. That's what I want to do. I want to say loop time. If I run now, my little character is going to keep doing his little sort of head bopping thing. So this is a very simple way to get some decent movement in your character. Make your character feel a little bit more alive. So again, you've got to create the controller. You've got to create your animations. In your animator, you have to drag your animations in there. And then you can double click on your animations to start messing with them. So I select my player. I have idle and run. Run has nothing changing yet, but idle does because we messed around with it. Nick, how do you get the animation to move while in play mode? While in play mode. So as long as we have everything set up with the animator component on our player and the controller in there, when the player starts, this arrow tells me that it's going to run the idle animation. And in fact, when I actually run here, what you see is this. You see this little blue bar. So this was it actually running that current animation. So you can also check if your start is connected into run. We don't have any run animation set up yet, or transition set up. So potentially, depending on which one you dragged in first, that's where the entry will be. So I don't have too much time left. So I want to get a quick run animation in, and then we will look at the transitions. Let's see. Luke, there's a couple ways to approach the loop. So if you have it looped in your actual animation, so the first set of keyframes is equal to the last set of keyframes, then you want to make sure to select the loop in your project tab, and then you can click on loop time. So there's a loop time check mark there. And that'll keep it playing. So if you only see it playing once, then it's likely that you haven't done the loop time. Okay, so I'm going to create a quick run animation. It's going to be very similar, but what I'm going to actually do is on the record here, I'm going to take the head position and I'm going to sort of put it forward like this. Yep. And it'll still be a 30-frame animation, so I do want to have my keyframe copied. So 30-frame animation here. And I'll probably do something similar where maybe midway through or maybe 10 frames through, the head sort of bounces up a little, and 20 frames through, maybe it bounces, maybe it's down a little bit. I won't bother changing the scale on it. For the body, I'm going to make sure.
How did you like rotate the head kind of forward? Sorry about that.
Yeah, so the motions for the rotation, scale, and movement, you can click on that. There's probably key bindings for it, but I typically don't use them too much. Up here in the upper left, so right below your file edit and stuff like that, there's 4 little arrows that gives you the handles to move X, Y, Z. The rotation gives you little bars that you can actually drag and rotate, and the scale one gives you handles as well. So whatever you have selected, you can click on one of those. So for the rotation, for example, I want to rotate the body or have the body be rotated like this. So I'm going to rotate like this, and I'm going to make sure that that rotation stays. So I'm going to click on the rotation keyframe and copy that to the 30-frame location. And maybe I'll do something with a scale here. So maybe it scales down slightly midway through. So I sort of have this run, wrong play there. So I sort of have this idle animation and this run animation here. Let's take the body scale and make sure that's copied too. So this is something that you'll have to mess around with a little bit. It's not entirely intuitive to use, but once you get used to it, it should become a little bit easier. The main thing here is just the keyframes and getting stuff set up so that you can easily use the keyframes. So this is my running animation, and then I have my idle animation as well. And so I need to hook these up. I need to make sure that there's a transition between the two, so that when I press like one of the arrow keys to move, it transitions to the run animation from the idle animation, and when I stop moving, it transitions back. So that's one of the important parts of this. Once you have the animation set up, we got to have a little bit of code that deals with this. So in the animator, so the stuff that contains my animations, I'm going to right-click on idle, and I'm going to say make transition, and I get this little arrow. So I need to have a transition that goes from idle to run, and then I'm going to right-click on run and say make transition, and I want a transition that goes back. So there's ways for me to go from idle to run and from run back to idle. This might look familiar from potentially other stuff you may have seen before in sort of other applications. This is a state machine. The animation can be in exactly one state at any given moment. And there are transitions that happen to cause you to change state. We're going to write our own game state machine for the next game that we make. But Unity has a built-in one specific for animations, so we don't have to make our own animation state machine. If I click on one of the transition arrows, it shows a bunch of information here. The key for us is going to be the conditions. When does a state transition happen? It happens on a specific condition. So we need to set what are those conditions. What does it mean? When do we switch? What's going to trigger us to actually switch? We don't have to worry too much about the stuff here. The thing that I do want to turn off is the has exit sign. So when I click on one of the arrows here, I want to turn off has exit time. I'll show you what happens when we turn the exit time on. So to create the transitions, you right-click on one of the animations, so idle or run, and you say make transition, and it will give you the arrow. And then whichever one you select on, that's the one the arrow. Whichever one you right-click on and say make transition, that's the one that the arrow comes from. So we right-clicked on idle, make transition to run. We just clicked on run to set it, and then did it the opposite way. Okay, so for our transition, I turned has exit time off, and we need to add a condition. This condition thing that we add is actually in the animation. Is actually in the animation itself. Actually, no, we don't want any extra layers here. Don't do that. We want here. Let's go into we want the animation. Here, and when we add a plus here to our condition, it says parameter does not exist in controller. So as of right now, there is no parameters for us to use. So in here, I can click on parameters, and we can add. So this is in the controller, and we can add one. So I'm going to add a Boolean. So I'm going to click on the plus. I say Boolean, and I say is running. That's my condition. So clicking on one of the arrows, I can say, and let me actually delete this one in there. I can say the condition for this transition is running is true. So from idle to run, is running must be true. On the opposite direction, running to idle, is running must be false. So I clicked on parameters in my animator, created a new one, a new Boolean, is running. Then in my transition arrows, I made sure that to go from idle to running is true. To go from run to idle is running is false. That's it. It's actually ready to go. The only thing left to do is hook it up in code so it actually changes that variable. So my player class, back here. My player class, when I do update, which I don't have in here at the moment, I just have fixed update. So I'm going to write the update method. If you have the snippets on, you can add that in there. Otherwise, you can just say void update with a capital U. I'm going to check if the input, which comes from fixed update, comes from my physics, if the input is greater than 0 or the input is less than 0. So in other words, if it's not 0, although I don't have specifically less, I don't have specifically not 0. You could just put not 0. It should still work fine. Then I'm going to change my Boolean value. So I'm going to have an if-else that looks like this. But I need a reference to the animator. Remember the component that we added? So back in Unity on my player, wait for it to compile here. On my player, I have the animator. So I need that reference before I can start messing around with it. So up here where my variables are, I'm going to say animator. Not animation, but animator. And I'm going to call it anim, or it'll autocomplete to that. Do the same thing I do for rigid body. Anim is get component, animator. Here. So I grab the animator component after creating the reference to it, and then I can say anim dot set bool, and then this is one of Unity's magic strings. I say is running as a string, and for this particular case, this would be true because we are running. Spell true right. Same situation here, except I would be setting is running to false. So I created the is running variable. I grabbed a reference to my animator in my player, and then I say set bool, or if you had an int or a double or whatever, you would say set and then the appropriate type. Set bool is running to true. There is a little bit of extra code that I have in here that we can write in here in just a second. But I'm going to save this. And we'll come back out here, and I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. Get a little extra space here. And then what we should see is that we're idle, and as soon as I press on the key, there's a little bit of motion for it to actually sort of transition from idle to running state. So I'll show you what to do, mess with that. But for the most part, it is changing. And over here in the animation piece over here, we see that it's idle, and then as soon as I click the key, it does that transition, and now it changes to run. So to make this transition a little snappier, if I select one of the transition arrows, I can take this time here and I can shrink it down. So this is actually how long it's going to actually take us to fully make the transition. So the snappier I want this to be, the shorter this transition should be. So I make those changes, I come back to the game mode, and it makes the transition much quicker. There's not nearly as much sort of motion from idle to run. It happens quite quick. Now he's not facing the right direction. That's what the extra little piece of code that I have in the slides does. So I'm going to write that in real quick. So if input is greater than 0, that's going to be one particular direction. And then I'll do else if input is less than 0. And I'm actually just going to change the rotation. Essentially, I'm going to flip the character over. So I'm going to say transform dot Euler angles. This is one of the things that you would probably end up looking up. These are just the angles that are related to the transform. So if I want to flip this character from one direction or rotate it or immediately sort of pop it into a different rotation, this is the way you do it. And it is a vector 3. I'm not going to change in the x, but I'm going to change by for this way. Actually, this way should just be right. So I'm going to have it be 0 for all of these. But for the other direction, I'm going to flip it in the y by 180. So if I'm moving to the right, positive input, then it's going to be 0. The rotation is going to be 0 in the y. If I'm moving to the left, so negative, then the rotation for this is going to be 180 on the y. And so that should give us our sort of flipping sprite. I have a feeling that the head is going to be behind the body, though, when we go the other direction. Yep. So that sort of looks like he's running. Obviously, the head being in front or behind the body in the other direction is not what we want. We'll mess around with the sorting layers. I'll probably show you that next time so that we can actually have this looking correct. I know that was a little bit fast because I know we're running just slightly a little bit out of time, but the animation stuff isn't too bad once you get used to it, but it does require a bunch of little fiddly stuff with the Unity Inspector. So if you need to, definitely go back to look at the video again on all the animation stuff. It's just a lot of right-clicking here and adding a property here and then hooking a specific thing up in another location. So I can help folks that had potentially an issue earlier on, but that was sort of all I had for today. So I will see you guys on Thursday. We're going to do some main menu UI stuff and some sound things. A little more code, but also a little more of this sort of Unity playing with the UI sort of setup. Again, if you want to take a look at the Ludum Dare games, they are all available on ldgm.com. You don't have to look at mine. You don't have to play mine. You don't have to do anything with mine. It's not a big deal, but I do recommend looking at other folks' games because there was actually a lot of cool stuff when I was flipping through a bunch of the entries. There's a lot of cool stuff folks made in 2 and 3 days. If you did work on one, I know there was potentially a group or two. If you feel like it, post it on Slack. That'd be cool for everyone to see. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day, and if you want to stick around, I can help out.
I have a very quick question.
Have a good one. Thanks, Professor.
Yep. Yeah.
Good one. Thanks, Professor.
Professor, so when I try to modify the run animation, it doesn't let me do anything on it. It just lets me modify the idle animation.
So yeah. So one of the big Unity can be a little bit finicky with a couple of these things. So when I'm on the animation screen, I do have to have the in the hierarchy. I do have to have the player selected.
Yep.
And then I'll typically just change with the drop down menu. So the drop down menu in the preview, I'll change to the run animation, and then I can start messing around with if I want to grab the head, do the record, and then I can start messing around with stuff in here. A lot of times that sort of the ordering of when you're clicking on stuff can potentially sometimes deselect the animation thing you're trying to animate, and then nothing's able to sort of be pressed up here to things. So potentially that's something to pay attention to and see if that helps. So again, it was no matter sort of what I'm working on, I'll make sure that I click the player, whatever it is, and then whatever animations I have in the controller, I'll make sure to go to whichever one of those I'm interested in, and then start messing around with the recording and the scaling and stuff.
Yep, that's all.
Even sometimes when I'm let's say I'm recording, and I even sometimes might click on something like one of the objects in the scene. Now it's deselected everything. So oftentimes I do just resort to only clicking on stuff in the hierarchy, because that seems to be the easier way to get it to keep things selected properly.
Got it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Professor?
Yep.
So every time I try to play the game, it says the index out of range exception index was outside of the bounds of array spawned the update. I get that every time.
Sure. So I'm just going to go into the spawner here. So it's possible that so the main thing we're using for array stuff in the spawner is this enemies array. So my purpose of putting this enemies array in here is potentially maybe you want different types of enemies, for example. So you could put different prefabs into this array, but that's done in the inspector. So in Unity, if I click on the spawner object, there should be a location for that array. There should be something in the inspector for that array. So it'll be whatever you name the array, there'll be a drop-down arrow next to it. And you'll want to change that size to however many enemy types you have. So we only have one enemy type. So I would set that to size 1. So it's just a size 1 array. And then for the element 0, that's where you'd want to have your enemy prefab. So you take your enemy prefab and you could drag it in there. So was that set to 0 or so? Yeah. So that would be where it was coming from. This is one of the toughest parts to get used to with Unity, is that if you create something that's public, no matter what it is, it could be an array, it could be just a single value, whatever. It is this sort of extra step to come back over to the inspector and make sure that it's set up properly, where maybe it looked like it was all good to go in the code, but then in the inspector it was missing something. So that is one of the things that can take a little bit of time to get used to in using Unity.
When I try to play it, like the fireball doesn't show up. Like I can move and everything, but like the fireball just doesn't show up.
So do you have values set for the rest of the spawner pieces?
Yeah, I do.
So let's see. We can go in your hierarchy. When you're playing, does it show any objects being created? So for example,
yeah, it does. It's like the enemy object or whatever.
Yeah, so you should have some enemy clones sort of popping up. When you're in play mode, click on one of them. Okay. And you can always pause as well, and you click on one of them and check where the location is.
Okay.
So for the position, for me, the position is the X is about 5 in this one, and the Y is, in this case, negative 0.4.
Okay. My X is -5 for some reason.
So that means it's spawning potential. Well, -5 because X is X. -5 to 5 is probably sort of around sort of the region you want. What about Y?
The Y was 6.
6. So Y. So that means it's way further up.
Yeah.
So that's something where in the script, in the script, I had a few things here where I instantiated. So my range here for the X location was -8 to 8, and I start the object at 6. Is it changing when you're playing? Is it changing from 6?
Let me see. No, it just stays at 6.
So we'll want to check to make sure that it is that it's doing the appropriate motion stuff. Now we didn't put any motion code in the actual enemy script, so there's no code in here that causes it to move. So the way that so the way, is that right? For the enemy, no, this was a spawner in our enemy script.
Okay.
That's where you want to go. Yeah, there's nothing that causes it to move in the spawner. So the enemy script, you want to make sure that you've selected some speed.
Yeah.
And then in the update, I showed you a sort of a separate way without a rigid body to move something. So you can say this.transform, which is the position and rotation stuff of this object, .translate, so it's going to move, and I want to move this down by the speed every frame.
I have that too.
So for your speed, what do you for the speed? Do you have something set speed wise?
It's the min speed and the max speed for the random range.
So back in Unity for the spawner, that's for the spawner okay. So that doesn't have anything speed related. So in the enemy prefab, check your max speed and min speed values in there.
Okay. Yeah, it's 0. That's why. Okay, I see it.
Make sure damage is something 1 or whatever.
Damage 1 and 3. Let's see. Yep. Okay. It's good now.
Good. Yeah, it's always these little things, and that is what I find in Unity is that oftentimes it is because of that disconnect between variables and stuff in the inspector. It's very easy to miss setting a variable to a particular value in the inspector. It's a very easy thing to forget to do.
Thank you, Professor.
Yep.
All right, have a good day.
Right. Other questions, guys?
Would you be able to go back to the player script?
Yes. So here is this. So the update stuff is what we just added. Is that what you were interested in? Or
yeah.
So this should work. I don't know why I put it this way. This should work with just input not equal to 0 to set the bool for running. So if you wanted like a gamepad, if you had like a gamepad and you wanted it to be analog, and you wanted the character to move just a little bit, like move over just a little bit or something, it would be a bit more code than this. But since it's just arrow keys or A and D, this just pops it right into the running state. And then just real quick again, the Euler angles, those are just the angles. Those are just the angles that this object is at. The other way to do this is to use a quaternion, but those are a bit more complicated to manually adjust. So the Euler angles are very easy. So it's just, these are the angles that everything's at. And for the Y, that's our sort of flip. We're sort of seeing it from behind. That's basically what's happening. So one direction, we're seeing it from the front. The other one, we're seeing it from behind. And it sort of does that flip for us in the Y direction.
So are we going to be putting these fireballs into like